So our first topic in this unit is genes and heredity. So we're going to talk about how your genes get inherited. So basically what happens is we have things called traits, and these are usually physical features that are expressed as a result of what is coded for by our genes. So usually traits remain the same or similar within a family because the genes are essentially the same, they're just kind of recombined in different orders. So that's why you look similar but not identical to your parents or your siblings. So a trait is a distinguishing characteristic or physical feature, otherwise known as a phenotype of an individual. So for example, as you see in the picture here, red hair is a trait. It's a physical feature. Traits are usually inherited, so they're transferred from one generation to the next, and it may be inherited from your mother or from your father or from a combination of both. So heredity is what examines the inheritance of biological traits. So your traits are controlled by genes on things called chromosomes that are found in every cell in your body. So your chromosomes are essentially your DNA. You've inherited half of your chromosomes from your mother and half from your father. So your traits are a result of the interactions between the genes from both of your parents. So more than 8 million combinations are possible from the 23 chromosomes that are inherited from each parent. So more than 8 million combinations from each parent will produce more than 64 trillion possible combinations for the offspring. So there was a 1 in 64 trillion chance that you look like what you look like. So heredity is the passing of traits from parents to offspring. So sometimes certain traits will get passed down from one parent or another or both. So for example, even things, it's not just physical features, but even things like talents, like your ability to play hockey or your ability to act or sing or something like that. That could be passed on from a parent down to their offspring. So we're going to look at the inheritance of one trait. So Gregor Mendel is the pioneer of genetics. So he was an Austrian monk in the 1800s, and he did lots of experiments with pea plants. So he proved the basic understanding of heredity so that certain genes are dominant over other ones. So through his work with pea plants, he's come up with many laws, and that still holds true today as the laws of genetics. So garden peas were perfect to use for Mendel's experiments because they provided a large number of different characteristics that could be expressed, and each characteristic only had two possible variations. So for example, if you were looking at seed shape, the pea plants either had round seeds or they had wrinkled seeds. If you were looking at the characteristic of seed color, they either had yellow seeds or they had green seeds. If they were looking at pod shape, they were either inflated or constricted. Pod color was either green or yellow. Flower color was either purple or white. So each trait only had two possible variations. So that made it very easy for Mendel to draw conclusions. So when something is a purebred, it means that it's descended from a common ancestor or a distinct type of breed where all members share similar traits. So we usually hear the word purebred in terms of dogs. So when dogs are purebreds, that means that they have descended from common ancestors and share the traits of those ancestors. Mendel produced purebred varieties of pea plants through selective breeding. So let's say he wanted to get plants that were purebred tall. So what he did was he bred a bunch of plants together, and some came out tall, some came out short. So he would get rid of all the short ones, and then he'd rebreed all the tall ones again. So again, if certain plants came out tall and short, he would get rid of all the short ones and rebreed all the tall ones. So he just kept rebreeding all the tall plants over and over and over again until the only offspring that were produced were tall. Okay, so that's how he got his purebred. So he kind of weeded out the other trait. So through all of his experiments, Mendel made quite a few findings. So the first one was that one trait always dominated another. So for example, one of the traits was always expressed and the other one was always masked. The second finding was that it doesn't matter if the sex cell comes from the male or the female. Each traits have equal chances of being expressed. It didn't matter. It's not that the male's traits were stronger or something like that. Factors or genes control what traits are displayed, and there are alternate forms of a gene called alleles. So those were his 4 findings. An allele is 2 or more alternate forms of a gene. So the alleles are located on the same position of one of the pairs of chromosomes in the organism, and alleles help determine what genetic trait will be expressed. So a gene is actually a combination of 2 or more alleles. Okay, so what happens is when 2 individuals come together to make an offspring, each individual will donate 1 allele for a particular gene. And when those 2 alleles come together in the offspring, that's what creates the gene. And then depending on which alleles are given to the offspring, certain traits will be expressed. So a dominant allele will determine the expression of the genetic trait in the offspring. So if a certain allele is dominant, then that means if it's present, it will be expressed. Okay, so for example, brown hair is dominant. So if an offspring has an allele for brown hair, then it's the brown-haired allele that will be expressed. Recessive alleles are overruled by dominant alleles. So that means that if there's a dominant allele present, the recessive allele remains hidden. The only way that a recessive allele will be expressed is if there's no dominant allele present. So for example, blonde hair is recessive. So the only way that an individual can get blonde hair is if they get a blonde-haired allele from their mother and a blonde-haired allele from their father. So during Mendel's experiments, he discovered that round peas are dominant while wrinkled peas are recessive. So if the plant contained an allele for a round seed coat, then that plant would produce round seeds. However, if it didn't contain an allele for the round seed coat, then it would produce wrinkled seeds. So a genotype are the alleles that an organism contains for a particular trait. So one allele for each trait is inherited from each parent. So various combinations are possible. So we'll talk about those combinations in a minute. But usually when you're doing genetics problems, which we'll do in a little bit, you use a capital letter to represent the dominant allele and a lowercase letter to represent the recessive allele. A phenotype are the observable or physical traits of an organism that arise because of the interaction of genes. So for example, depending on which alleles you inherit, you'll have certain physical traits that are going to be expressed. Okay, so you'll have brown hair, or you'll have blue eyes, or you'll be tall, or you'll be short, and stuff like that. So genotypes can be homozygous or heterozygous. So a homozygous genotype is a genotype in which both alleles of a pair are the same. So remember, it's 2 alleles that make up a genotype. So if both of those alleles are the same, then the genotype is homozygous. So they could either be homozygous dominant by having 2 dominant alleles, or homozygous recessive by having 2 recessive alleles. If a genotype is heterozygous, that means it contains one of each type of allele. So it contains one dominant allele and one recessive allele. However, with a heterozygous genotype, this individual will still physically express the dominant trait. So for example, if round seed coat is dominant and wrinkled seed coat is recessive, this individual here that's heterozygous will still have a round seed coat. this individual here that's homozygous dominant will also have a round seed coat, but this individual right here that's homozygous recessive will have a wrinkled seed coat. Because remember, the only way that a recessive trait will be expressed is if there's no dominant allele present. So in this genotype here, there is no dominant allele, and so it's the recessive trait that's expressed. Okay, that's the only way that you can get the expression of a recessive trait. Otherwise, like I said here, if you get heterozygous, one of each, the dominant will still mask the recessive, and the dominant one is the one that will be expressed. So we're going to look at monohybrid crosses. So this is one of the first types of crosses that Mendel performed with his experiments. So the breeding of two organisms with different traits is called a cross. So in order to track the inheritance of a single trait, Mendel crossed plants that differed from each other in only one characteristic. So he looked at one characteristic at a time. So for example, he was either looking at seed color or just seed shape or plant height. So only one characteristic at a time. Okay, so he only switched up one variable. So when you're looking at only one trait, that is called a monohybrid cross. Okay, mono meaning one, hybrid meaning combination. So he was only looking at one trait when you're combining two individuals. So monohybrid cross is a cross that involves only one allele pair of contrasting traits. So only one trait is involved. And a specialized chart called a Punnett square helps us organize the results of a cross and show the possible combinations of alleles in offspring. So this can be used to predict the phenotypes and the genotypes of offspring. So we'll actually do examples of monohybrid crosses in the next video. So just a couple of rules to remember when you're doing Mendelian genetics or monohybrid crosses, that each parent has two alleles for each trait, and each allele has an equal chance of being passed on to the offspring. It's completely random. Each parent must pass on one of the alleles and only one, so each parent passes on one of their two alleles to each individual offspring, and some alleles can hide or mask others, so that dominant versus recessive. So each parent, like I said, has two alleles, and the alleles separate because only one allele from each parent can be passed on to the offspring, and this is completely random. So just because an allele is dominant does not mean that it has a greater chance of being passed on. Each offspring inherits one allele from each parent. If the dominant allele is present, it will be expressed, even if the recessive allele is also present. So again, for example, in that heterozygous individual. The recessive allele will be expressed only if both alleles are recessive.